So they decided to not even open the bags at this stage because it was likely that there would be more body parts. So they actually put them straight into body bags, which are the black bags that are much thicker, that are used for moving bodies.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised.
This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grave Secrets. We're your hosts. I'm Beth.
And I'm Annie, and what have we got? Another case study. So this one is in Hull, so it's not actually that far away from us, really, is it?
No, not at all.
And this is from 1998, so a little bit of an older one.
Yeah.
And a 999 call was made to the police, and the guy who made the 999 call had made quite a gruesome discovery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which must have been, I know we say this all the time, must have been quite horrendous for him to see.
Yeah.
But this led to a whole sort of investigation, which was quite tough, really, for the police.
A tough investigation and quite kind of wide scale as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're going to talk about it in more detail for the next hour. But it did become really complex from the off.
Yeah.
And I think just one of those where, thankfully, it did all move quite quickly as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think there was as much kind of hearsay or press and things like that about it.
Yeah.
Because of how quickly the investigation moved.
Yeah, which is credit to the police
the team.
officers that were involved. So if we go back to the 30th of July, 1998, so this is when the 999 call was made to the police, and it was made by a guy called Tony Snowdon, who was a pump attendant at Great Culvert pumping station. So at first, when I looked at pumping station, I thought like petrol station. I thought, is that what they call a petrol station? And then I had to look at it because I'd seen the photos from the crime scene, and I thought that's not a petrol station.
Yeah.
So the pumping station is like a station that clears out any debris from drains and keeps water flowing. So there's like as water comes through, there's a grid across it that catches everything and acts as a sieve. So it's so like dirty water and everything else is not being continued up the river.
Because around Hull and the surrounding areas, there's quite a lot of water. So there's the River Humber.
Yeah.
Fun fact as well, my friends will be rolling their eyes because I once flew a biplane over the Humber Bridge.
Did you really?
And I tipped the wing so that the kids in the back could get a photo. I was only
really
obviously
cool.
what's the word? Co-pilot.
Yeah.
Because someone else flew the rest of the time.
Yeah.
But for a little while, I flew a plane.
That's quite good. But do you know who you remind me of when you said that? Do you remember that kids' TV programme where she flies in the plane?
Outside
yes, that is you. That is actually you.
Yeah. So yes, so there's the big River Humber, and then there's quite a lot of little kind of estuaries and things along the way. So these pumping stations are kind of crucial because they are just responsible for filtering
it out, isn't it?
So
and
it
as
was,
well, the water sometimes, because obviously the water doesn't flow uphill, but these pumping stations have pumps in them that sort of pushes the water to where it needs to be, because it's not all flat either.
No.
So it's basically a great big sieve.
It's a great big glorified lock / sieve.
Yeah, it is. And I had to look at pictures of this as well to actually get a grasp on
what's going on.
And then whatever gets caught in the sieve then gets extracted onto like a pile on the land.
Yeah.
Then I'm guessing they dispose of that in a different way. So Tony Snowdon was actually walking his dog, I'm guessing, before his shift had fully started. And we always say this, it's the dog walkers that find it, and it was actually his dog that had come across something, and Tony then went to see what it was and discovered that this was in fact a human arm.
Yeah, I think the dog kind of obviously ran off, started sniffing something. It looked like a bin bag, so I wasn't sure what was in the bin bag. And then Tony went up to take a closer look. At that point, couldn't quite work out what was in this bag, peeled it open, and it was quite clearly a human arm.
Yeah, so it had actually been severed at the top, so it was like a full arm, wasn't it?
And again, that's not something... Like, we've covered another case where a limb was found in a body of water, but it was actually the canal workers that had pulled it from the water.
Yeah.
This was actually on the kind of wasteland around.
So it had already been filtered through, and then from the waste had been removed and put onto the land,
Yeah. Obviously horrific for, Tony to have found, and then rang 999. Just to note as well, this pumping station's in a place called Sutton, which is like East Hull. Just for anyone that might know
anyone
where
that's
Hull
from
is.
there.
Yeah.
So the first officer on scene was called Paul Davidson. He was actually the senior investigating officer. And I don't know if you saw this, but he actually went on to write a book.
Yes.
On this, which I've not got round to reading.
I thought it must have been quite cathartic for him in a way, because as far as I gathered from his interviews, it was actually his first major crime case, his first murder case.
Yeah, he said in one of the interviews that it was his first job as SIO. So imagine your first one getting called out to something like
and
this.
Again, there's murders and there's murders, isn't there? This one's clearly a murder, because it's, how else does a limb get in a bin bag?
Yeah.
But again, that's not, as awful as it sounds, you get your more obvious murder cases where you know who your offender is because the knife's in the hand, you know who your victim is. Yeah. This one is from the off.
It's a little bit more complicated. So you've got Paul, who was senior investigating officer, and you've also got Trevor Lawley, who was the crime scene manager.
Yeah.
And I did watch some interviews with Trevor as well, and he was saying on the way to the crime scene, he was very matter of fact. He was saying, this crime scene isn't going anywhere, so while I'm driving there, I'm going to be thinking about resources. I'm going to be thinking about how many people I need, what I'm going to find when I get there, what team I'm going to need on this. And I thought, God, that's so logical to be sat there. But it's obviously how...
Yeah,
it's how
crime scene manager.
That's why he's good at his job.
He did remind me of some of our team at Think Forensic, actually.
Yeah,
just the way he came across. He seemed like he'd be a right good laugh, but then also
really good at his job,
incredibly logical.
And he said he wasn't too worried about the crime scene in general because it was all very secured already because of the pumping station. It was surrounded by like gates and like a big 6-foot fence, so it wasn't like people were going to be walking through it and destroying anything. He was like, it's not going to go anywhere. I know exactly what I need. Again,
in the UK, you see these kind of metal railings quite often. Yeah, quite often as well, along things like, we've got the Transpennine Trail and stuff like that. And they're the big, thick metal railings that have got the spikes on top, designed specifically to keep trespassers out. So he saw that all the way around the perimeter and thought, you're not going to have, people coming and going, walking through there.
Yeah.
So it is pretty controlled as a scene already.
Definitely. So the SIO and the crime scene manager are sort of working together at this point, and they go through to have a look actually where the arm has been found. Yeah. So we've said it was severed at the shoulder, but parts of the fingers were actually missing. And I was thinking, is this intentional, as we spoke about before, for identification? Yeah. But why would you sever the fingers and then we find out a little bit later that there is a tattoo on there? Yeah. So the tattoo is very... Well, I wouldn't say it's like very distinct, but it sort of...
I think it is and it isn't. So basically up on the kind of, on the wrist area, upper wrist, I would say, like lengthways going up your arm, they noticed a tattoo, but it didn't appear to have been professionally done. It was almost more in blue ink than it was in black ink.
It was like someone had said to your friend who's just qualified, oh, can you just draw this on me? Yeah. More than like a professional, you've gone in and sat down and been like, right, this is what I want.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it spelt out the word chaos. So it was a tattoo of the word chaos. And again, when you referenced the damage to the fingertips, it was some and not all. Yeah. Which, again, if you're doing it consciously to try and dispose of evidence,
You do them
or
all.
to stop identification, you would do them all. But then from the looks of things, there wasn't that much damage to the bag, so it didn't look like it would have been an injury to the limbs ante-mortem that had been caused by this sieve in the pumping station.
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure.
No.
But when you've got not even a victim, you've got part of a victim, the first thing in the investigation is obviously to try and identify this person.
Yeah.
So is what the police do in this case is actually check the missing persons reports, because they have got this identifying factor, which is the tattoo.
Yeah.
They can then check through, and they did find that there was a missing persons report, and one of the reports had a tattoo recorded on file.
Yeah. So they call them antecedent markers.
Yeah.
So they can do it for offenders, but equally if you've got either victims or missing persons, they'll also note these antecedent markers.
Yeah.
So there was a potential match, but at that point they couldn't say categorically.
They just know it's someone with a tattoo, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they looked at the name on the file for this, and it was Natalie Clubb. But then you would have to have a look and look into sort of Natalie's background.
Yeah.
And in this case, she had actually been arrested in the past for sex work, so her details were on the database as well, which in this case, it made it easier to identify her. Because at this point, if no one had reported her missing, and if she wasn't on the database, you'd be sort of going around in circles for a while, wouldn't you, trying to find something?
Yeah, it reminded me a little bit of in the Sunset Strip murder case, when they were trying to identify the victims, because they had previously been arrested.
Yeah.
Again, they were more easily identifiable because
of
they were in the system that way.
And in Hull at this time, there had been quite a few sex workers had been murdered in the previous months, and the police sort of thought, well, you know, even though it's not fitting directly with the MO, could this be linked to it? Because if it is, we obviously have some sort of serial killer. So that's sort of the first thing, really. But if you think about the crime scene in general, how big it is.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, obviously they've now got some intelligence to suggest that whether or not it might be Natalie, so they're going to be investigating that. But still, the largest piece of evidence that you're going to be able to get is from that crime scene, which was quite vast. So there was a large brick building on the site. There was also a big digger, which, as Annie mentioned earlier, would lift all of the debris out from the sieve and then scoop it onto the wasteland. This meant then that there's a large pile of debris, and they've got to investigate all of that. So they had a team that were doing a search, like, you know, we've talked about with the white sticks, kind of going through and investigating all of the wasteland that surrounds this pumping station. Because you've got the station itself, but then you have got a lot
They've got
of
to
land.
go through all of the rubbish.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, you'd be looking for other body parts, but you're also looking for, you know, like black bags and stuff, because you know that the arm has been found in a black bag, so you'd be probably looking for something similar.
Yeah.
But the SIO and the crime scene manager in this case thought it would be a good idea to get an aerial view.
Yeah.
So they actually flew over a helicopter.
And again, it did give you an idea of scale.
Of how big
the
it
scene,
is. Because at first, when I saw the pictures, I thought, well, a helicopter, you're only in this area.
Yeah.
But then when it went up and you could see the aerial view, I thought, wow, that is actually quite, you know.
Even though it's controlled, it's still
And it's a
lot.
very remote area as well. And if other body parts have been found, you've also got to think about what we've mentioned in a few other episodes, like animal scavenging.
Yeah.
Because it was quite a remote, rural area.
Yeah, so
you just
even
don't
if
know.
they've all been at the pumping station at one stage, it doesn't mean to say that that's where they've stayed.
Yeah. So the crime scene manager in this case was searching through all the debris that was left on the ground, and he actually found a plastic bin bag again.
Yeah.
So it looks similar to what the arm was found in. So obviously they start going through that and start unwrapping it. And they actually find a head wrapped in a plastic bin bag. But the features are all, they're that badly decomposed that you couldn't really have any identifying features at all, but there was maggots and there was hair left as well. So hair can be a good indicator.
They could tell that it had been severed, again, like the arm. They did believe that it was human, and they believed that it was female at that stage. But like you say, there was a lot of maggot infestation. So that was as much as they could tell, really.
And at this point, you're thinking, because you found 2 body parts, this is probably not the scene of the murder. This is the second site. So this is the deposition site. Yeah. Whereas now you're thinking, well, where did the murder actually happen? Yeah. Because we need to find the source, sort of thing.
And again, I think it's difficult because generally offenders aren't this calculated.
Yeah.
So you think, well, who's committing this offence? You know, quite often in the case of the murder of Barry Wallace that we discussed a few weeks ago, they thought that was gang related from the off, because they were like, who else would be taking...
It's so horrific.
Yeah, and like premeditated in terms of disposing of the evidence.
I'm guessing this was something similar because it was quite violent, wasn't it?
Yeah. So again, while they are getting the aerial shots, they're conducting the search, they actually obviously have an even wider search to carry out, and that's because of all the water, the body of water itself. Obviously, it looks, or it appears, that this is how the body parts have got to the pumping station in the first place, via the water. So they then had to get a dive search team to go into the water, and they actually went a quarter of a mile upstream, didn't they?
I was going to say, because you'd look, because obviously you know the water's coming towards the pumping station, but you'd have to work away from the pumping station, wouldn't you, to find out points of where it could have been.
Because if anything's caught and got stuck on debris or where it could the banking. So it was actually a man called Ron Morton, and he was head of the dive team. Again, they said that their main focus was to find any kind of smaller fragments of evidence or any other body parts that might not have got stuck in this kind of sieve, or that might have got trapped on something else. But it's incredibly difficult. We have mentioned this before, but I think it's important to reiterate just how tricky this specific role is. Obviously, all of them have their own nuance, but the water is basically black when you look in, because it's so dirty.
No visibility at all. Even with a light, there's no visibility.
And the way that they work, they're kind of attached to each other in almost like a chain.
Yeah.
So they've all got the head torches on, but again, that's not really making any difference.
Maybe doing a little bit of help,
So it's all fingertip searches, and they're effectively covering the same ground twice, because they have to do the fingertip search. But, I mean, if you ever think about when you're in bed, and sometimes when the lights are out, I'll try and place my hand on my phone or something, and I'll know roughly where it is, but I still miss it. I'm still going round it. If you imagine that, you don't want to be doing that and missing crucial evidence.
And I thought, with it being in water as well, like, things can move. Yeah. So you might search one place and then you move on to an next, but the evidence might then float past. Yeah. It's moved, hasn't it? So I understand why they do it, like, obviously
so meticulously.
More than once,
unfortunately, they didn't find anything significant. So at that point, they are still working with, obviously, the head and the arm at that point.
Yeah. So the police obviously now think that this could be Natalie. Yeah. So they start looking into Natalie's background and her friends to get like a bit of a clearer picture of who she was. Yeah. So Natalie was only 25 and at the time that she was reported missing, and she was a mom of 3. And whoever reported her missing, which we later find out was her boyfriend, had said that Natalie had a tattoo that was chaos. And she'd done that and had that specific tattoo because apparently she was quite chaotic. Yeah. And they said she just caused chaos everywhere she went.
Anywhere that kind of in her life it kind of did amount to chaos.
But she'd had quite a sort of a tough life in general, because she'd been married to the father of her 3 children, but the marriage had broke down and she'd actually moved to Hull to try and start a sort of fresh life. And this is where she met Darren Adams, who was Natalie's boyfriend. He's the one that had reported her missing. But we later find out that he was also a pimp. She'd then been addicted to heroin and lured into prostitution by Darren.
Yeah.
Which is so sad, isn't it? You know, you've come to find a better life somewhere for you and your kids.
Yeah.
And you just fall in with the wrong crowd and that's it.
Yeah. And again, I'll kind of read a statement out later, but it was basically within an 18-month period that all that had happened.
Yeah.
Which again is very chaotic.
Did you have a statement from one of the children?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they are at that point pretty sure that it is Natalie. So they are questioning people that know her, but obviously they still need to conduct a post-mortem on those body parts.
Yeah.
At that stage as well, when they were investigating Natalie, so it was two-pronged. She'd been arrested before, so that was on the database. But it was then this man called Darren Wells who had reported her missing, and that had been 2 weeks prior to the body parts being located. So there was an interviewing officer in this case, Sean Weir, and he was going over all of the notes. And she'd actually been reported missing on the 14th of May, but the boyfriend had actually reported her missing via a telephone box. So which I thought was a little odd, but then it was back in 1998.
That's what I thought, because I was like, oh, why would you do it from a phone box? But
yeah, I thought always trying to be anonymous, but then I thought, oh no, actually it's just the time.
Yeah, and she'd actually been last seen in the red light area as well. So I feel like we've said this in loads of different cases. The boyfriend or the partner usually becomes the first person of interest, don't they, in general? And
also the last person to have seen them alive.
And these two did actually live together as well. So they lived in St John's Grove in East Hull before Natalie had disappeared. But officers had attended this address quite a few times after she'd been reported missing, I'm guessing to speak to Darren or give him updates or something like that. So the officers had actually been out to this house.
Yeah.
And I did see pictures of it, and from the outside, it was all boarded up, wasn't it? Even though someone was living in it, it looked like someone wasn't living in it. Yeah,
it did look more like a kind of squatter's house than anything else. So in the mortuary, they obviously analysed the body parts. They did actually manage to get finger marks from the remaining fingers that had remained intact, which were then processed and sent off to the Fingerprint Bureau.
Yeah.
While they're then still examining the head in greater detail.
This is the thing, though. They've still only got an arm and the head for the post-mortem. You've not even got a full body.
No. They managed to identify that the head had been dismembered at the 6th cervical vertebrae,
which is called it's called your C6. So it's located in your lower neck, and it's one of the ones that help your neck move and rotate. So it's like sort of the lower neck.
And they thought it was some kind of serrated knife potentially that had been used.
I just can't help but thinking how much force it would take to do that with a serrated knife, because it's a tough area. Obviously, you've got your spinal cord, you've got your vertebrae, which obviously you've got to go through, and the whole head.
And I just thought as well that like the length of time that would take. You know, when you think of like where this might have happened.
Yeah.
No one's suspicious. Like
no one's heard anything.
No one's heard anything. Yeah. I mean the smell.
Yeah.
Like there would be a distinct smell.
This head is in the advanced stages of decomposition, so not much can really be found from the head other than what we've just said.
No. And again, because of all of the maggot infestation, they couldn't get anything other than that.
Yeah.
But by 2 a.m. the following morning, the head of Scenes of Crime actually rang Paul Davison to confirm that their deceased was in fact Natalie Clubb. So at that point they did have enough
confirmation,
despite only having those two body parts, which again just goes to show how incredible the forensic workers are.
I just think if her DNA was on the system, like any blood or anything like that, and then the fingerprints, you know, it's a pretty conclusive method, isn't it?
Yeah. So they're only at the second day of the search.
Yeah,
now.
and they already know who it is.
And they already know who it is. They've already gone up in a helicopter and done quite an extensive search. They've had the dive team out. And they then do find further bin bags, 2 or 3 with more heavy objects in them, and the bin bags had been tied, whereas the other ones were partially open already.
Yeah.
So they decided to not even open the bags at this stage because it was likely that there would be more body parts. So they actually put them straight into body bags, which are the black bags that are much thicker, that are used for moving bodies out to the mortuary. And then, so they were secured, taken to the mortuary, and they actually x-rayed them while they were still in these bin bags before then examining to make sure that there was as little to no contamination as possible.
Yeah, because of the decomposition process as well. If they've been in a tightly sealed bag, the decomposition process might have slowed down. But as soon as you open that up and you expose it to the elements and air gets in there, you know, you're changing the decomposition process, aren't you?
Yeah.
So to do that,
you're kind of interfering as soon as you've touched it.
Yeah, in like a safe environment, I think was the best thing to do, especially because the head was so decomposed.
Yeah. So the pathologist then obviously examined the first bin liner and then the second, and there was at that stage a decomposed, now they said back of the torso, which kind of threw me off because then they said that it looked like at the front of the torso there was wounds, so I was unsure as to the description of said torso.
Yeah, I got the impression it was just a torso, but I don't know why they'd say the back.
Yeah, that's
because then you'd think it had been cut.
That's what confused me.
Ways, which is weird.
But I don't think
that's
a
strange thing to do
because of other things they'd referenced. So I think just they found a torso, and they noticed that there were 5 or 6 puncture wounds, which were significant. But then they also believed that it was likely that Natalie had been kicked or punched multiple times, which would have led her to fall on the ground. And they believed that she'd fallen to the ground because it looked like, due to the injuries that she'd been sat on, there was like excessive force to her.
And these were ante-mortem, so these were all before death. So we knew there's a lead up to the death, and there's been a struggle. So I mean, if there was ever any doubt that this wasn't a murder from how they found the evidence, like now this has proved it, hasn't it?
Yes,
really?
Definitely. So again, quite a lot of conclusive information on just the second day.
You know what I did find interesting though, that the cause of death and all this information from the second post-mortem was kept a secret. Well, kept enclosed, so only the people in that room knew. And the senior investigating officer actually said, well, there's 3 people in this room that know what happened, and there's one other person, which is the killer or the killers. So that's quite clever that nothing could be released to the public. So you're not going to get anyone saying anything from the papers or anything that someone else knows. They know because they did it, which I thought was quite...
very clever. And again, for him, first case he's worked on. Well done.
Yeah, I wonder who taught it. Who taught him?
So again, by August, obviously the investigation's continuing, and like with any other case, they are interviewing family and friends, and it was Sean Weir again that interviewed Darren Adams. So Darren's name was also known to the police. He was actually seen as being a career criminal, which is someone that basically doesn't have any long-standing job. They might have a part-time role as a bit of a cover, but generally speaking, they are repeatedly committing crimes to fund their lifestyle. He was believed to have been the one that was responsible for getting Natalie kind of wrapped up in this criminal world. And he was then known to have got Natalie not only into sex work, but then also forced her into quite violent situations. Yeah. So we mentioned that they were living at St John's Grove, but Adams would tell her to bring clients back to that address, at which point he would be armed with a baseball bat and he would then rob the clients of whatever basically they had on their person.
It was sort of a bit like a double whammy really, because I'm guessing with with Natalie being in sex work, maybe she'd already lured them in with that and maybe got them to pay and said, come back to the house.
Well, that's what I mean.
So maybe
I
she'd
think
got them to pay and then they took everything else they got. It was a bit of a double.
And I just think for her it would be awful because she's already not going to want to have to, work.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, that you are luring someone into a violent situation, but she's just got no choice.
She's
at that
got to
stage.
Do it.
So he was interviewed. He was treated initially as a grieving boyfriend because they haven't got any hard evidence to prove that it was or that he has any involvement. So they're treating him as he was, her boyfriend, despite the fact that they know that he has got violent tendencies.
Yeah.
But again, they were very much trying to build a rapport with him to gain as much information as they could. He did seem quite agitated and annoyed. And they did actually present him with images of Natalie's body parts.
And you just think if someone shows you photos of your partner dismembered, there's going to be some form of reaction. But it was quite cold, wasn't it, with it? And quite...
Yeah, he got angry, but it was almost like, again, more defensive than it was breaking down in tears after seeing your girlfriend has been treated in that way.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to say, obviously, with anyone's reaction. So creating all these interview questions and the strategy behind how they were going to tackle Adams based on his personality and his previous took weeks. And I think
they had like a full document, didn't they? On how they were going to conduct the interview, what sort of questions they were going to ask to be able to get a response out of him. Like not just your normal techniques, was it? They brought a specialist
you don't want him
in.
to just shut down from the off. And again, he's only a person of interest at this stage. Because, again, like you mentioned, there'd been 2 other murders of sex workers in the area. So they still don't know whether or not it's potentially
if these are
linked.
Connected. And I find with this case as well, like when they go and speak to, sort of Natalie's friends, her friends might have also been in sex work or been drug addicts.
Yeah.
And it makes the whole witness and interview process even more difficult because how do you know they've not taken anything prior to it? Like, did they see what they thought they saw because were they under the influence of drugs? And they are actually classed as unreliable witnesses because of the addiction.
You could absolutely tell with Paul Davison, that was the SIO, that he was really conscious of that. He reiterated quite a lot that he was worried about his evidence being circumstantial because of the lack of reliability of these types of people. Just because either they could be drug induced or, so he was saying whatever account they give, how much validity can we put on that? And again, witness statements are unfortunately one of the biggest causes of miscarriages of justice. So you absolutely don't want that stopping justice for Natalie. He did say that that they recorded all of the interviews as well.
I think that was a good thing to do because you don't know if they're going to change the story, if they're going to remember something different. I think getting it all on camera the first time was probably the best thing that he could have done. And then that can also be presented to a jury as well, so they don't have to go on the stand then. If they're having a bad day or they've just took some heroin, they then can't come on a stand, can they? So to video them and show that.
Have you had a bad day?
Or
just
heroin.
Taken heroin. So in some of these interviews with people, Neil Pattison's name came up. He actually owned St John's Grove, that address that both Adams and Natalie were living at the time. And apparently Pattison had a bit of a soft spot for Natalie. So knew them both really well. But unlike any of the other kind of associates in this case, he wasn't an addict. However, that's not to say he wasn't part of this criminal underworld in Hull, because at the time he was actually in prison for the murder of an elderly woman.
Yeah, that was in I think a robbery gone wrong, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. So they, again, needed to speak to Neil Pattison because clearly he knows the pair. They were living at his address. They need to know what information he kind of has. And at that point, there was another interviewing officer called Andy Marshall, who Andy was my favourite.
He was really good, wasn't
Yeah.
he? When I saw some interviews with him, and I liked his like logic and the way that he did stuff.
I thought it was a good balance of, which is how I would like to think that I would be if I were ever in one of these roles, a good balance of like logic and strategy in terms of what's best for the case, but also a real empath.
Yeah.
Like you could tell that it got to him.
Yeah.
Not to say that the people that don't show it don't feel it.
Yeah.
But I think it was a lot more overt with him.
Yeah, and I think Patterson sort of at first when they went to see him.
Well, they actually had to go and interview him in prison, didn't they?
Yeah. And he wasn't too keen on talking, but he said to the investigating officer, "If you get me out of prison and into police custody, then I will talk." Yeah. So it was almost like bargaining, wasn't it? But I mean, I suppose that's what they do, isn't it?
Yeah, especially someone like him that will have been probably in prison previously, or at least had run-ins with the police.
No, they know the system, don't they?
Yeah. So obviously now there's 2 links to St John's Grove. So they decided that it was important to go back to that scene and search it for any intelligence. They actually entered via the back door, which again is when you are trying to preserve any evidence that there might be. If you think that potentially either an offender's come through the main door or that's where you might have significant evidence, you're going to want to think counterintuitively and approach it from a different angle. They did say that the scene on the inside was just in squalor.
I saw some of the photos and it looked pretty disgusting.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it looked like a
drug house. When I don't know what they're called. Like yeah.
But there was urine-soaked furniture. There was drug paraphernalia all over.
It was absolutely filthy.
It was filthy, but then there was also like, I wouldn't even say mess. It was like debris. It was as if there was just like piles of like rubbish and stuff that hadn't been moved. So if you are thinking it could be a potential scene, again, that makes it really, it's difficult because in some senses it makes it difficult as a scene because there's a lot to go through.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you think, well, if they've not tried to clean it or cover it up,
everything should still be there.
Be really good in terms of forensic evidence. Yeah. And the dirtier it is, the more you get like your insect infestation and things like that. So I guess it's kind of a catch-22.
And the police wanted to take full control of this scene, so obviously they boarded up what wasn't already boarded up and cordoned.
Yeah, they actually used the big like metal. You see them sometimes with derelict buildings where they use the big reinforced like steel metal boards for the doors and the windows. At
this point, Adams was actually put under surveillance as well. So he was an addict and heroin was a very prevalent drug.
Yeah.
But they thought by putting him under surveillance that it might lead to the discovery of more body parts.
Yeah.
Because now they knew that he was a suspect, they thought he might go back and just check.
Yeah. And again, if he is someone on drugs, even if has been a part of this case or has been a part of the murder, if you then have a drug binge, are you more likely to slip up because you're not thinking rationally or logically?
Yeah, and maybe go back. But the police had actually said that while he was under surveillance, he'd walked into a family's house who were watching TV and ripped the TV out and walked out with it. Like,
yeah,
that's insane.
Yeah, so at that point, again, Andy Marshall, who we mentioned, he was involved on that team. And he said they had to
bring him in. Yeah. It was getting too extreme, isn't it?
Yeah, they were like, we can't just watch. Yes, he's under surveillance, but we can't just let that happen.
Yeah.
While this is obviously going on, at the same time, they are now interviewing Patterson properly. So they had managed to agree with the prison that Patterson would be taken to Beverley Police Station and properly questioned. And again, they said you could just tell it was going to be a long process.
It was so slow, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I thought they were going to get him out and then he'd have to talk straight away, but it wasn't, was it?
No. Again, they taped each interview and they didn't actually conduct all of the interviews in Beverley Police Station. They actually took him out and about, and I don't know, it seems like they used to do this more kind of back in the day. I don't know whether there's too much red tape around it and too much paperwork.
You don't see it
now,
as
but
much
you don't hear of it
as
as
much
often,
now.
do you?
No, but they actually took him to a village called, was it Paul?
Yeah, I think so.
And the officer then wrote down a list 1 to 10, and he asked Patterson to tick the numbers which were correct.
Yeah.
So it was almost like, because he wouldn't talk and say it directly, they were trying to get indirect information out of him.
Yeah.
But he actually ticked 7 of the boxes to say they were correct. And the other 3, he said, work it out, you're the detectives.
Yeah, which is...
So I think all 10 he might have knew.
So were they, like, just facts about the case? Like,
Yeah.
you... Like, I'm assuming that they'd have written, like... I don't know, like, however they phrase it, like, we believe that, you know, Adams has got something to do with it.
And I think they were, like, the locations as well.
Yeah, because they did actually take him back to, it was actually 119
Yeah.
St John's Grove, but they took him back to that location as well. And it was just odd because it was almost as if Patterson would kind of give them nothing or give them a little bit, and then all of a sudden he then turns round and states, oh, Darren served her up.
Yeah.
And that was while he was being questioned, and they were a bit taken aback, weren't they? Because they were like, what,
yeah, they
what
had
do you
to say,
mean by
like,
that?
what do you mean? Because it is a prison slang term, isn't
Yeah.
it, for stabbing.
Yeah.
But he also said that he bumped into Adams on the drain bank.
One
But,
thing-
like, why was he there?
Yeah, I know.
So I was thinking, like, oh, are they blaming are they going to start blaming each other at this point?
One thing which was interesting, though, even from that one statement, when he used the like the gang or prison slang about being served up, because that relates to being stabbed and the cause of death hadn't been revealed.
Yeah.
They knew that she'd got 6 or 7
Stab wounds, basically, yeah.
puncture wounds. So that would align with Adams having had something to do with it.
Yeah, and Adams and Natalie had apparently been arguing the night before as well.
Yeah.
Taking, they said, like, Russian drugs, but it was temazepam. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so apparently Darren claimed that he was drugged up on some Russian shit and
yeah.
just lost it while he was arguing with Natalie. And then, again, this is according to Patterson, but Darren had said that he'd picked up a knife and stabbed her, and then woke up in the morning having found that there was a knife still in Natalie's chest.
It's really, I don't know what drugs you could be on to not actually know
I
and
thought
be
that.
in bed with someone or near in the
Yeah.
vicinity of someone. But after this, Adams then apparently goes in the direction of someone else's house. So Larvin is another person that now comes into, that is now brought into to question.
So a man called Michael Larvin, who was basically Adam's best friend, wasn't he?
Yeah, and they run in the same circles, and they both had their addictions. But when Adams goes in the direction of Larvin's house, Patterson then goes to the house to see what's happened to Natalie, because I think maybe he wanted to check on her or see what had happened, because you've just been told that someone's... what someone's done, or I just woke up and she's got a knife sticking out of her chest. So he'd obviously gone to... Remember, this guy's not the drug addict either. He's probably gone to think, I have a soft spot for this girl, let me just go and see if everything's okay. Yeah.
So at that point, he does go to St John's Grove. He finds blood on the bathroom door, and then ultimately does see Natalie's body in the bath, covered in a blue blanket. And he kind of referenced this blue blanket because he said that he actually pulled it back a little bit to basically what's the word,
to see if Adams
check.
was lying, like to see
whether or not there were
corroborate the
stab
story,
wounds. And there were in fact stab wounds. So there's a lot of information coming in at the investigative team all at once, really, because they've now got all of this account from Patterson. They've then had another name thrown in the mix, so now they're going to have to interview Larvin, and this investigation now continues for another 10 months. while they're, talking
So
to Larvin.
it's got them up to this point 10 months to get this information out of Patterson.
Yeah.
So he's still probably in police custody all this time. So he's going to drag it out because he don't want to go back to prison, does he?
No, not at all.
He's already on remand for murder.
Yeah.
So he might as well make the most out of his time.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's actually crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. So again, the two kind of... So I mentioned the senior investigating officer, and then you've got, it was actually Kevin at that point, who was the crime scene manager. And they had decided to, they say, take a run at, don't they?
Yeah.
Interviewing Patterson. Again, they said they were in the exercise yard of the police station. And he said it was really hot weather. And again, I like these little details that they give you sometimes.
You paint a picture, don't you?
Because it paints a picture of how normal it kind of has to become.
Yeah.
They are just talking with this guy at this point.
In jail, in an exercise yard.
Yeah, but in an exercise yard. They said that they'd actually got lollies because it was so hot out there. And they're all just sat having this conversation, and out of nowhere, out of the blue, Patterson says, "Oh yeah, and by the way, when I actually went round the back of the house at St John's Grove, I did see Darren Adams and Michael Larvin." And he said it was really weird because they were both topless from the waist up, covered in blood, washing each other down. And again, just that visual is so terrifying. Do you know what I mean? Two men, probably high, covered in blood, washing each other's body down.
And he described it in quite a lot of detail as well. So he obviously described them covered in blood, but he also described the smell and said that he noticed hacksaw blades on the windowsill and 9 bin liners.
But again, I just thought, this is how, different people live, isn't it? Because if I saw that, I would be like, oh, I'd be backing up out of there while I'm still in the garden.
I thought though, could he, because he'd gone round the back of the house, could he get out that quick?
Well, yeah, but I'd be like, oh, okay.
And you know what they've just done to someone else, so you'd think, oh God, are they going to do that to me?
Well, exactly, because this does then kind of happen, doesn't it? So he does go into the property again. At that point, he notices things like bin bags, the hacksaws. He probably at that point is getting the gist of what might be going on.
Yeah.
And just in case he wasn't getting the gist of what was going on, he said he could tell that Larvin especially was not happy that he was there, which you wouldn't be, would you?
No.
So Adams and Larvin actually made him pick up one of the bin liners, and when he picked it up, that actually contained Natalie's head. So at that point, they then said, "You're involved in this now, so you can't say a thing."
Yeah.
And you just think, oh my God, it's like something out of a film.
Yeah. So that's why he thought he couldn't come to the police straight away, because he was now thought was going to be classed as a maybe accessory or something.
Yeah. And again, you don't know whether or not there'd be enough. He could get done for the murder. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? You don't.
If them two ganged up and blamed him, it's two words against one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just can't imagine that whole scene. But to think that they were just so quite casual. Because this house as well, the property itself is a semi-detached. Now, I don't know whether they're like old council houses, weren't they? And so I'm assuming that there was no one living at the house next door, because I mean, you'd
surely
be next
not, because you'd have complained, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but
maybe.
I mean, it's a squat, and then they're out the back
cutting up a body. Yeah, and they're in the topless, covered in blood. Which, horrific. If someone looked out their window, they'd have been able to see them.
Yeah. So again, we've 10 months have passed now, but the following May, based on all of the forensic evidence that they gathered and Patterson's statement, they actually had another breakthrough, if they've not already had a couple of breakthroughs. Yeah. And that was because, thankfully, because they'd boarded up the premises and they were pretty certain that it would contain or did contain significant forensic evidence, no one had entered the scene for all of that time, despite how much time had passed. So they actually went back in there, the crime scene manager went back in there with his team and re-examined. So Trevor, again, just...
I know, a year later as well.
Yeah, really came through on this case.
Yeah.
And and it was completely preserved from what they could tell. They then could look, based on Patterson's account, for more specific evidence, and they did then notice that there were drag marks and blood marks which looked like they were leading to the bathroom. Again, he'd said that he'd seen Natalie's body in the bath. And they actually used, now you'll be able to pronounce this better than I will, diazofluorine.
Yeah, diazofluorine, but he said it the wrong way around.
Yeah, I noticed
so
that.
I think he said...
He said 1-9.
And it's 9-1. Yeah, it's the opposite way, because when he said it, I was like, is it really that?
Yeah.
So it's a chemical used to develop fingerprints, which is on porous surfaces. And the chemicals react with the amino acids in the fingerprints, and they form fluorescent derivatives. And then they will then fluoresce under blue-green light, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
it's a
so
certain
they call it
wavelength.
quasar light.
Yeah.
So you can get like normal quasar light, but they use it at such high frequencies that it then illuminates.
So with the correct light source, you can then see quite a lot of detail. And what they did find here, when they looked on the walls, they can see that some quite crude things had been written on the walls.
Yeah, so
I thought that was so strange.
Yeah, really interesting, because they didn't say whether or not it was like, because obviously I was thinking what had been written with, whether or not it was like graffiti paint or whether it would been painted over. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they said it had actually been painted over, but they could still see it from underneath. So it had just been painted over, maybe with a light. Coat of paint sort of thing.
But they were actually references to murders of sex workers. So again, you think, did Larvin and Adams write them? They would obviously have been aware.
Yeah.
Because obviously Adams was a pimp, so he was involved in, sex work. So he would have known about the victims of the other crimes.
Yeah.
So you think, well, have they intentionally tried to throw off the investigation
by trying to make it linked to the others?
But they also then found an empty creased bin liner which appeared to have human flesh, scalp and hair on it.
I just can't imagine opening a bag and you find a scalp.
No, I know.
I just...
Now bear in mind, we know that Natalie is the victim because she's been identified via the body parts, but those body parts were found at the deposition site, the pumping station.
Yeah.
There's actually no concrete evidence of the crime scene in terms of where she was killed at this stage.
Yeah, where the murder actually happened.
Where the murder had occurred. So, yes, they knew she lived there, but they needed forensic evidence to say categorically Natalie was murdered here.
Yeah.
And this, like, hair, scalp and human flesh would give them, hopefully, that DNA evidence. So that was sent for testing. And again, that took a week. Someone actually asked me recently, like, how long it takes for things like that to come back. And it is just so dependent on budget of the case.
It is, because you can't always fast track stuff. You can't always do that, can you, with every piece? Even though it's important, with every piece of evidence, you can't be like, it's important, fast track it.
And also how many other cases are important. So they said that they were like waiting, obviously, with bated breath. But within a week, they did have a confirmed match that it was Natalie.
So you've now got Natalie, proof. You've got the connection to the address now. So you've got two different crime scenes, one where the murder took place, one which is the deposition site, and now you've got all these people linked to it as well. So now you're trying to find out what actually happened. So when there is more than, two or more people involved, we do tend to find that then they start to blame each other, don't they?
Yeah, they turn on each other. And again, depending on how much forensic evidence you've got, it is just one person's account against the other.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to ever really say.
And I feel like in this case, no one's more reliable than the other.
No.
You know, they're all pretty unreliable witnesses, aren't they?
So pressure's obviously mounting. You know, Adams and Larvin would know that it's closing in on them. They're going to see the CSI team turn up for, all this time later for another search of the address. And clearly the pressure did get too much, because Larvin actually then went and approached officers wanting to get his side of the story across before it could be disputed. He basically stated that Adams had come to him and confessed that he'd killed Natalie, But Larvin said, I had nothing to do with the crime. It was all Adams. But yeah, maybe I did then help him after the fact.
But then Neil Patterson was a witness to say that both of those were linked.
Yeah.
To the crime. From what he saw, both of them are linked.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, in a way, he incriminated himself, didn't he?
Yeah,
because he's
absolutely.
just corroborated basically
what Patterson said.
what Patterson said, even though he wasn't that much of a reliable witness. He's more credible than them two, I think.
So they did then have enough to charge Adams with the murder of Natalie Clubb and then Larvin with assisting an offender.
Yeah.
Again, it's difficult because assisting an offender doesn't sound like a massively serious charge to me. Like some people get assisting an offender for giving a false statement. This was a lot more than just a false statement.
What's it called? Getting rid of a body.
But it's disposing of a body.
Disposing, that's it.
But it's how much evidence specifically they've got. They probably didn't have Larvin. If they'd have got Larvin's DNA on the bin bags and the body parts, maybe it would have been different.
Yeah.
But you can't say based on that evidence that they'd have enough. So the trial did begin on Wednesday, the 15th of March in 2000. So quite a significant time had passed.
But Sheffield Crown Court as well. When I saw that, I was like, oh, Sheffield, that's very local, isn't it?
But again, that goes to show how thorough this investigation was. And they absolutely wanted to get them convicted.
And there is still a lot of circumstantial evidence. And it is based on very chaotic witnesses in general, isn't it?
Yeah, so again, like we mentioned, the chief investigating officer was dubious that they would actually come out with a guilty verdict in this case just because the witnesses are known criminals with drug issues. So according to the prosecution, and it was Andrew Campbell that was like the prosecution, the QC, Adams had murdered Natalie after a dispute at that address, which was drug-induced.
Yep.
He stabbed her multiple times in the chest. Then he went round to Michael Larvin's house, told him about what he'd done, and then enlisted him to help cover his tracks, basically. They had dismembered her body in the bath, then put Natalie's body parts in black bin liners, loaded them into the car, and then took them to a nearby waterway on the outskirts of Hull. So it's then that obviously once they'd been put in the waterway, they'd have come up at the pumping station. Obviously Patterson was put in the witness box and he actually looked at Andy, who was one of the interviewing officers, and like smiled at him and winked before providing his testimony. So you just think again, like, oh God, is he gonna?
Which way is this gonna go?
Yeah, is he gonna say something that he's not said before? Like, is he gonna stick to his account? You just don't know.
They're unpredictable as well, aren't they?
Yeah.
But it did turn out that even with Neil Patterson's criminal background, there was enough supporting evidence for what he was saying, and that they thought the jury would accept his evidence.
And I think a lot of it did link specifically back to forensic evidence as well, which made it a lot more plausible. So
what he was saying, it had a backup, didn't it?
So when he'd referenced this blue blanket, which obviously, why would you make up a blue blanket?
Yeah.
Blue fibres had actually been found on Natalie's body parts.
Yeah, so he obviously didn't make that up.
Again, this account is making sense.
Yeah.
So the trial itself lasted for about 2 weeks. But then on the 13th of March 2000, they did then receive a verdict. And Darren Adams was charged with 25 years minimum. And Michael Larvin was sentenced to 6 years.
I don't think that was enough. 6 years.
I don't, but this.
I mean, I know they can only do what you can prove, can't you?
Yeah.
But they did actually both appeal as well.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how. Yeah, I'm not sure how, especially Adams was able to appeal. And if I was Michael Larvin, I don't think I'd have appealed that because I'd have thought, wow, that's not actually a bad sentence for what I've done. I've cut up and disposed of a body.
And hidden it for that length of time.
Yeah.
Like, even if he'd have helped Adams to cover his tracks to a certain degree, he's never come forward after the fact.
And in November 2017, at the age of 55, Adams was found hanging in his cell. So it was
in
thought
Lindholm prison.
Yeah. Where is Lindholm? Do you know? Is it down south?
I'm not sure,
I've heard
actually.
of it before. I just don't know.
But it can't
where
be
it is.
local because we've not really
heard of it. Yeah, I'm not sure.
There was actually a kind of investigation into it launched into that as well. But it's just such a calculated and heinous crime.
Yeah.
And it is something that you just can't really imagine taking place in, an end council house terrace in, a built-up area of Hull.
And I just feel sorry for Natalie's children as well, because I know that they said it was like an 18-month period where, the mum had sort of gone off the rails a bit. But I think they probably fully expected things to go back to normal.
Yeah, so her children remained anonymous and still do, but they did make a statement, so I'll read that now. We all believe that Adams was an evil person. There is no two ways about it. He ruined many lives. Not only did he murder our mum, he chopped her up and threw her away in bin bags. Some parts were never found, and we don't even know what it is in our mum's grave. Maybe some people who commit murder deserve a second chance, but not Adams. Yeah. He was very cunning and even reported her missing himself. He blamed others for her death. Our mum lived a chaotic life, but it was only when she met Adams that she got into drugs.
Yeah.
And again, that's the thing, isn't it? You forget that he reported her missing, so it was very calculated.
Yeah.
They did go on to say, she wasn't perfect, but she was never given the chance to improve and be the mum that we knew she could have been. She was a free spirit and enjoyed life, but she made one mistake, and that was getting involved with drugs, and she paid a terrible price. Yeah. If nothing else, we hope this sends out a message to other young women who may be getting involved in drugs. Our mum was a very young mum when she died, and she could have turned her life around. Some people get into trouble all their lives. My mum had an 18-month period where she was involved in drugs, and within that 18 months she was killed.
It's so sad.
Yeah, it's just terrible, isn't it? But I think really, really powerful statement, because it does put it into perspective. Yeah. And you think, people can make one decision that completely changes the course of their life.
Yeah.
And you just never know. So hopefully we've done the case justice. As we say, it's about remembering the life of Natalie Clubb. She was born 15th of the 2nd, 1973, and was murdered on the 13th of the 5th, 1998, and leaves behind 3 children.
Yeah.
And obviously a wider family.
Yeah.
But yes, so that's the case. I just can't believe that Larvin will just be living his life now. Do you know what I mean? It's
I wonder what he is doing, or I didn't even look. I sometimes have a little Google and see if they've come out, or
would something like that finally be the trigger that stops you ever?
Because what year did they? Was it 2000 when they got convicted?
2000 was the sentence.
So he could have been out in 2006.
Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah.
But there we go. So thank you ever so much once again. If you haven't already left us a review, we would really greatly appreciate it. And if there's any cases that you want us to cover, if there's any kind of discussing the evidence type things, we've not done one of those for a while.
No, we haven't.
So let us know what you think, and hopefully you'll tune in again next week. So take care.
Bye.